without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Dorothy Advincula, Senior Vice President with Ipsos' Media Development Team. Dorothy, you have the floor.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us today. So before we jump right into the data, let's first talk about the source. So for the past year, we have been discussing the impact of the COVID pandemic on affluent purchasing and media behavior, and its resulting pent-up demand. And because of our continuous and always ongoing research, with our latest data release, the spring release, we're able to share with you not just pent-up demand, but what Affluents actually did during the pandemic. In our first full year 2020 view of the data, we are excited to share these findings with you today and hope you find the same aha moments we did when we began looking at the data. And we hope you stay through to the end of this presentation, as we may have an additional insight straight from the vault that we may be able to share with you at the end as well. So we are in an enviable position to help clients put the changes of the past year in perspective, since our Ipsos Affluent study is the longest running and most widely used study of affluence in the United States. How? Because we are literally interviewing virtually every single day. Releases in spring and fall of each year combine 12 months of continuous fielding. So our latest spring release boasts of data from all 12 months of January to December 2020. And because of the relative size of our audience, we're also able to touch in quarterly with our respondents to get a pulse on in-depth insights on a range of subjects, such as finances, travel, smart home, and everything else. So we call these our quarterly barometers. In fact, we just wrapped up one recently, and we will be sharing those results in our upcoming May 12th webinar. So if you haven't yet, please sign up for that webinar, and the information will be available in the PDF that is included in this portal. Okay. And because we do our survey entirely online, and all of it is respondent self-directed, the pandemic did not really affect ongoing interviewing. In fact, as we would do with the data today, we're able to compare and contrast information that was collected pre-COVID against interviews that were completed during COVID. And the spring 2021 release of data is based on over 20,000 interviews, roughly a third of which took place prior to when state-by-state lockdowns began, the period we mark as pre-COVID, and 2/3 of which were done after the country felt the impact of COVID restrictions, which we mark as the COVID period. And because they will be our focus for the rest of our time today, let's get to know more about this audience. When we say affluence, we're talking about adults who are age 18 and over, living in the United States, in households that earn $125,000 or more in income. And the median household income is a little more than $188,000, and the median household net worth is $990,000, although 1 in 4 affluents has a net worth of $2 million or more. And today, there are approximately 71.6 million of them in the United States, and they're fairly evenly split among the genders. And the majority of them are married or in a committed partnership, and are also educated and have advanced degrees. So these are the lenses or the color that we need to look at when we talk about affluence. And they matter because although they may be a small part of the population, they actually control a lot of money. According to the Federal Reserve Board, the top 20% of the U.S. earning households possess almost 3/4 of the total net worth in the United States. And maybe you're like me. Before I got onto this team, the profile of an affluent person, at least on my mind, was that they were mostly male, mostly white. In short, that they all looked the same. Let me tell you that the data proved me right about that. But for data, that was from 30 years ago. And because we've been conducting this survey for over 40 years, we have a front seat at witnessing the profile change. Fast forward to 2021, and that affluent profile has changed and is no longer in monotone. The data tells us that today's affluent population is comprised of 71% whites and 29% non-whites. Still majority white, but less drastically so as was 30, 40 years ago. And this diversity in perspective, experiences, and identities color the way affluents experience their resources and their wealth. And we will see that today. Today, a little bit more than 1 in 3 affluents are Gen Z or millennials and growing substantially, while boomers and seniors are declining in proportion, particularly as many of them retire. With the shift in generation comes a dramatic change in the racial and ethnic makeup of affluents, as well as a shift in their attitude, political beliefs, and their motivations and priorities. And we'll explore some of those changes or the impact of this profile change into how affluents behave in our data that we will be sharing today. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Tony Incalcaterra, Chief Research Officer of the Ipsos Affluent Survey.
Thank you, Dorothy, and hello again, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So there are 3 primary areas that we're going to focus on today. First, and this is top of mind for everybody, how did the events of the past year change affluent spending? We're going to follow that up with an analysis of the increased reliance on social media, and then we'll give you an in-depth look at how media consumption habits shifted as well. You know, the common perception is that due to COVID restrictions that were in place last year, people spent less money. And certainly parts of the economy were devastated due to cutbacks. Restaurant dining was severely impacted. Airlines, rental car companies, and local economies that were dependent on tourism were really hit hard. But during 2020, we spoke to a lot of affluents and got this sense from them about their feelings of denial, that certain things that they took for granted were really no longer accessible to them. Now, it would be easy to think then that affluents simply stopped spending on non-essentials. However, we now know, based on the data that we've collected, that affluents actually spent more money during COVID than they did before the pandemic. It's just that they spent it in different sectors or different categories. So, you know, with less access to physical retail stores, they shifted their spending to online in many places. And in many cases, that shift made sure that they paid premiums to obtain goods and services over what they might have previously paid. So they were hungry for entertainment and diversion, which also drove some of this additional spending, and you'll see it. You know, the average affluent household spent over $137,000, and that actually aggregates in total to $3.9 trillion for the population. This represented a $17,000 increase from last year, or about 15%. Overall, the data shows us that affluents did not hold back on their spending. In fact, as I said, it increased. But there's so much to be said about that. You know, there were winners and losers among the categories. So affluents significantly increased their spending on goods and services that were related to home and garden. You know, we were confined to home for so long, the realization was that we needed to make the home environment as conducive to working from home, conducive to remote learning from home, and you know, quite simply, having this constant reminder that there were imperfections in our living space that really needed to be addressed. So, you know, a focus on living well and self-care also helped to drive that increase in spending. So we see things like organic and eco-friendly products up by $355, personal care and wellness products up by $733 per household on average. Now, given the depressing news throughout the year, is it really any wonder that we also spend an additional $332 on alcoholic beverages? So, while these categories increased, the spending on things like travel declined. So travel per household down $817 per household. Charitable donations fell, and this was really likely due to the fact that there were so many fundraising events and opportunities that were canceled. So we didn't have the same opportunities to gather with other like-minded individuals. And of course, live events were canceled for the most part, causing the average amount spent to drop by 18%. Now, if affluents were spending more in certain categories, could they also be spending or buying in new ways? And yes, actually, with many retail outlets closed or under capacity restrictions, we saw many affluents that were shifting their spending to online. So last fall, when we talked to affluents, more than half of them told us they were purchasing products online that they would normally buy in store. And many of them told us they were going to continue to do so after things got back to normal. So when we see things like online purchases of alcoholic beverages taking a large increase among affluents, it's not really a surprising statistic, but frankly, it is something that's likely to going to continue. So, we also see things like purchasing items for the home. And interestingly, magazine and newspaper apps increased spending. Now, one of the things that we did see in some of the media data that we're going to talk about in a little bit is an increase in digital readership that frankly is likely coming from this increased expenditure on magazine and newspaper apps and the purchases that you can make in those apps. Of course, on the other side, travel-related online expenditures and event ticket purchases saw the largest declines. Now, not only was the spending in these categories moving online, at least among affluents, but it was also going mobile. And this again signals that this diversifying profile of affluence, as many of the younger generations and underrepresented minorities are mobile-centric or mobile-first, is changing the way that affluents engage and purchase. So affluent ways of buying, as I said, have really changed. Recently, we've been hearing about the rise of subscription services during the pandemic, home deliveries of products. And I can confirm that affluents spend in that regard is really helping to drive that rise. So not only were affluents moving online or going mobile, but we also see in the data that they're using subscription services more and more across many different categories. So currently we have 1 in 4 affluents who've embraced the use of grocery delivery services. And these are things like Fresh Direct and Peapod, while another 17% subscribe to meal delivery services such as HelloFresh, Blue Apron. Because pets are part of our family and important to us, pet supply delivery services like BarkBox and PawPack also saw substantial increases in the number of affluents subscribing. And this really indicates that affluents still tangibly experienced and sampled products during the pandemic. They just couldn't get to them in physical ways due to the lockdown, and therefore they found other ways. So these pandemic restrictions, such as travel and dining out, while it provided a roadblock, it also provided an opportunity. If they couldn't get on a plane, they could at least get something interesting and have an experience that arrived in a box. Now, marketers and designers really need to take note of this phenomenon because it really could mean that subscription services and boxes are a much better, a new potential way where you can reach affluents and introduce them to your brands. So, not surprisingly, I don't think anyone here is going to question this. Millennials and Gen Xers were really the ones who drove the increase in subscription services. So during COVID, 27% of affluent millennials and roughly 1 in 4 Gen Xers used the grocery delivery services, twice that of the older generations. Across the board, those two generations were far more likely to purchase through subscription services compared to both the younger and the older counterparts. And as you're going to see further in the data, these generations seem to indicate a nativity that is using and engaging in new commerce platforms. Now, with face-to-face contact really almost impossible during COVID, social networks became a lifeline, for information and comfort. In a typical week during COVID, 91% of all affluents spend time on social networks. To me, astonishingly, the average affluent spent 15.4 hours, or 9% of all hours in a week, including the hours that we spent sleeping, were on social media. This represented a 12% increase in the average number of hours spent compared to pre-COVID levels. And much of it, as you can see from the graph, is centered in these highest levels, these highest number of hours per week. Now, Facebook continued to be the dominant destination, and it commanded a 23% share of total social networking hours. But the generational differences are really sharp. So, whereas roughly half of all boomers and seniors, half of their social networking hours were attributable to Facebook, Gen Z only devoted 8% of their social networking hours there. That youngest generation spent far more time on YouTube and Instagram. Regardless of generation or gender, social networking hours increased during COVID. And again, it was really no surprise to us. But as more people spent time on social networks, so did the percentage of people who made purchases directly through these social networking sites. 1 in 6 Gen Z and millennials made purchases, while 13% of Gen Xers did as well. We did, however, see a decline in the number of boomers and seniors that were purchasing through social networks. We spotted a correlation between those who make purchases on social networks with those who subscribe to those delivery services that we were just talking about. And in every category, there's an increased number of affluents using those subscription services. Now, there may be a few things in play here that marketers should take note of. And the first is that it really shows the emerging importance of social commerce. Many of the subscription boxes relied on influencers and their social feeds to market, to essentially a captive audience during the pandemic. Because let's face it, who wouldn't love a good unboxing video? Second in importance is really the critical element of curation. So subscription boxes or services can be a way that consumers are enabling or having brands curated for them, brands and products that they're getting exposed to online. So, it may be tough to remember that one brand or item that you thought you needed when it showed up on your social feed. And it was really just right after another item that you also thought you needed. So the ease of commerce, the ease of purchase while you're there makes a huge difference. And as such, marketers really should think of subscriptions, as an example or a case for this curated experience. How can you help foster such an experience for your customer or for those who would like to get to know your brand? Now, turning to media. Many media brands have, faced a double-edged sword during COVID. Out-of-home exposure suffered, whether you're talking about publications or television. And in fact, original content, particularly, looking at sporting events or scripted television, essentially went on hiatus. So what we saw in the data is clearly that the importance of a brand's digital assets compounded in the race to distribute content during COVID. For publications, the loss of public place copies was problematic. And with commutation down, and many newsstand and retail outlets shuttered for a period of time, this really made matters worse. The high traffic areas generally provide significant opportunity to see for many publications. And with waiting rooms and reception areas devoid of physical copies, there was the expectation that readership of printed copies would decline sharply. Now, the losses that we did see for printed issues was not as significant as one might have expected. We speculate that with more free time on people's hands, copies of printed publications that had accumulated at home were now getting the chance to be read. We believe that this was also a driver in the increase in what we call opposite gender readership. So what we see is more men reading traditionally women's publications and more women reading traditionally men's publications. Now, given the difficulties surrounding obtaining printed copies of publications, it really was nice to see that the digital issue readership increased during COVID. So publication branded content was still desirable, and Affluent simply found new ways to still stay in touch with their favorite brands. Now, there was a slight increase in the percentage of Gen Z reading print issues, which seems to go, against the idea that this is a digital first group. But it could very easily be explained by the fact that during COVID, many younger folks moved back in with their parents to essentially wait out the pandemic. So in the homes of those older generations, these youngsters were more likely to have better access to their parents' print publications. And therefore, it could explain the additional readership, the additional print readership we see for Gen Z. Now, for all generations except seniors, we saw this digital issue readership increase. Again, when you can't get content in one way, you figure out how to get it in another. Now, early in the pandemic, and we've talked about this in the past, we noticed that television viewing spiked. Affluents were in search of information and diversion, frankly, from all of the bad news. But as time went on and as people became accustomed to the restrictions and established a new routine, we did see the television viewing slow down and return to more normal levels. As a result of the change in people's needs, we saw news-oriented television networks like CNN, BBC World News, and Fox News gain. They were also helped by the fact that there was a contentious election happening. Now, on the other side of the fence, with sporting events canceled, including the Olympics, networks that were devoted to sports saw declines. Broadcast networks like CBS and ABC also lost viewers. And this was really likely due to the fact that scripted original content production was halted for a good part of the year. Now, the real winner in viewing was streaming video on demand, SVOD. 84% of affluents watched one or more hours of content from an online streaming service in the past 7 days. And astonishingly, 44% of those affluents spent 11 hours or more per week watching these streaming services. The overall increase in hours really was driven by the shift in heavy viewing. So we actually saw fewer people watching in the lower ranges and just enough people in those heavy ranges to take up the number of hours. So the big five SVOD brands, Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, YouTube, Hulu, and Disney, they continue to dominate the streaming wars. Between them, or in aggregate, they capture more than 3/4 of all viewing hours. Now, Hulu, with its heavier reliance on broadcast content, was the only one of the big five to lose users and hours watched during COVID, although it really was just a slight loss. Now, while the big five account for the lion's share of viewing, we really want to point out that the smaller streaming services have a strong potential to be significant players moving forward. So these smaller services like Sling and what is now Paramount Plus, are gaining and garnering significant numbers of viewing hours that really come close to those enjoyed by the bigger services. So as cord cutting continues and more people shift to these services for the content, for their entertainment content, what we're going to see is that they would have previously gotten that content from broadcast and cable, and now they're turning to these services. So they're going to become even more significant in the battle for eyeballs. Now, advertisers are going to need to keep an eye on these services because they're likely going to be one of the primary ways to reach affluence moving forward. We've also known for some time through our TV Daily's syndicated studies that movies and good content bring families together. The results from our Affluent study point to the same phenomena, that regardless of race or ethnicity, streaming households are more likely than non-streaming households to agree that they and their families enjoy watching movies and television together. And this is really likely the best chance to reach affluence co-viewing with their children. So we've presented a lot of information today about the shift from old habits to new habits. So let's just take a few minutes to recap what I think are the most salient points. And the reality is that affluence evolved to meet this new normal. So it changed so much of our lives, but the fact of the matter is that affluence learned to survive the fallout. They refocused their lives, and they actually thrived in many ways. We've seen in earlier research that their household net worth actually increased in the past year, despite what was happening in the country as a whole. So when we look at spending, we see that while affluents were generally prevented from the pursuit of some of the most important things to them, like travel, they indulged in other areas while the pandemic continued. So we saw new spending or increased spending in certain categories, that were making up for the money that would normally have been spent in other areas. We think that when we see things like the increased adoption of subscription services, that those are going to continue post-COVID. So it's a new way of looking at these things. Now, the surge in social commerce, we see that this is particularly important. It's increasing for males and younger generations, and it's going to present a growing opportunity for marketers. They're going to be able to reach affluence when they're in a positive frame of mind. And the ease of transaction and the assurances of security are going to make this even more important. We often hear about the rise of TikTok. So while traditional social networks continue to claim the largest share of hours, young upstarts like TikTok and Nextdoor are really going to be expected to challenge the status quo. Marketers are going to need to look for ways to capitalize on these social networks, really in an effort to stay relevant in this rapidly changing social media landscape. And finally, let's look at media reinvention. So media brands are reinventing themselves to stay current. They're shifting much of their content to more easily digestible digital bites. We're going to continue to see losses in the more traditional ways of accessing this content. But smart media brands are really changing their whole business line. So they're looking at ways to ensure that affluent audiences are going to continue to relish in their content. So things like podcasts, which are becoming more important for every media brand. They're going to increase, and the real question is, will advertising dollars follow to support them? So today's presentation is figuratively the tip of the iceberg. The Ipsos Affluent survey contains many, many thousands of data points, and that covers everything from demographics like age and gender, education, to an exhaustive battery of psychographics and attitudinal statements. And although we've touched on some of the media data that was contained in the study, the survey actually includes cross-platform exposure, meaning for a media brand, whether it was reached through a traditional means, through their website, through social media, through podcasts, and we capture that data for more than 250 media brands, which allows you to, or enables you to identify where you're most likely to reach your target audience. Now, as Dorothy alluded to in the beginning, we thought we'd give you a little teaser with a little bit more insight. So among the many changes that COVID brought was really a shift in how we pursue leisure activities. Especially among those, or especially those kinds of activities that are more individual in nature. Victory gardens were huge last year. As anybody who knows, or anybody knows, who tried to buy seeds or plants at Home Depot or your local nursery, they were completely out of stock. But we also saw that there was an increase in those people who were playing video games, painting, drawing, pursuing photography as a hobby, playing a musical instrument, and even bird watching. Now, in contrast, there were declines in anything that were more group activities, such as volunteering, gambling, going to casinos, or enjoying a tailgate party or two. What was particularly interesting, and I think sad, was that many of the gains in leisure activities were primarily due to men enjoying additional free time. Especially those that started working from home during the pandemic, eliminated those long commutes to the office. So suddenly they had some additional time. Unfortunately, through past research that we've done during COVID, we learned that women were more likely to take on the additional household responsibilities as a result of COVID, much more so than men. And as a result, they became the primary caregivers. They took on more of the homeschooling duties, and they generally were more stressed than men during COVID. While there were some increases in leisure pursuits for women, they were really dwarfed by the increases that men enjoyed. As Dorothy and I spoke at a virtual consumer electronics show equality event earlier this year, clearly more needs to be done to level the playing field for women. We anticipate that we're going to continue to monitor this disparity and hopefully report back better news. So thank you very much for your time today. We hope that you found the information insightful and helpful. As we mentioned earlier, please join us for our next webinar on May 12th. And this is where we're going to look at affluent consumption and attitudes about podcasting, really to get an understanding of the adoption of this relatively new medium, how marketers can evaluate them, and essentially understand what is next for affluent consumption. In the handout section, you'll find a link to the registration page. So we hope to see you in the next 3 weeks. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for your time.
I really want to thank Tony and Dorothy for today's interesting presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We are out of time to answer any live questions, but if you submitted one, then we will get back to you by email. You will also receive an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation. Additionally, as Tony mentioned, you can reference the handout section in your event console for more about the research we shared today. And of course, we welcome the opportunity to speak with you, so please feel free to reach out to us. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.